So it's interesting. Over the last couple weeks, I've had a few of you kind of ask me a couple different things. One, I've had people say, Torres, there's 3 weeks left. There's 2 weeks left. There's a week left. What is your final four at the beginning of March, at the beginning of championship week, at the beginning of whatever? I'm here to tell you, I don't really do, mid-season final fours, pre-tournament final. I need to see a bracket before I get too excited and before I start picking teams. And so we talked about this a little bit on the Wednesday night recap show. But essentially, rather than doing a pre-conference championship final four, what I instead want to do is this. I want to go through the teams that I believe can legitimately win a national championship because I think the group is smaller than in most years. And it was funny on the Wednesday night show. I had a lot of you ask me, like, okay, who are some dark horse Final Four national championship contenders? And I believe this is a year where there is separation at the top, where those top 6, 7 teams, I think, are just better. And I think we're going to see kind of a favorite heavy Final Four over these next couple weeks. Said it on Wednesday night. I don't believe that this is the year for a Loyola Chicago, a George Mason, a Florida Atlantic, whatever. And I think for the most part, if you've been good all year, I think you have a good chance of getting to the Final Four. And so what I want to do now is give you the only 8 teams that I believe can win the national championship. Before we get to it, one last thing. I know there are analytics that tell you, okay, you have to be top 15 this and top 10 that, and your offense has to be this and your offense has to be that. To me, when I look at teams good enough to win a national championship, essentially what it boils down to is one simple question. It is, do you have the dudes? Do you have the players to win 6 straight games against 6 different opponents, 6 different styles, etc.? Every year, people ask me, Torres, what is the secret to winning in the NCAA tournament? It's not having a number 1 seed. It's not playing in your region. It's not having fan support. It is, can you beat different teams playing different styles? I've told this story a million times. The day after Virginia lost as a number 1 seed, I remember talking to an assistant coach who had been part of multiple national championship teams. And he said, Aaron, unless that offense improves, you cannot win playing that way. You can't beat 6 straight teams doing that. Well, Virginia's offense improves the next year. They win the national championship, but that has always stuck with me. Are you versatile enough to beat different teams playing different ways? And if so, who are those teams this year? So let's get to those teams and let's work backwards from number 8 to number 1. And I'll start with number 8, and I'll say this. I don't think it's likely, but I do think it's possible that at number 8, the Duke Blue Devils can win a national championship. And I know what you're thinking, Torres, Duke, whatever, blah, 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 blah. But first off, they were my preseason national championship pick, so I got a little bit of a soft spot for them. But when I look at Duke, it boils down to the question that I just asked a minute ago. Do they have the players? Do they have the guys that can win 6 different games against 6 different teams playing 6 different styles? And I believe that they can. First off, and I've said this a few times, it feels like nobody is like this is the first year I can ever remember Duke really hasn't been discussed all that much on the national stage. They're 24-6. What is crazy is they started 5-3. Late November, early December, they lose back-to-back games, one of which I was at Arkansas, and then they played Georgia Tech in their ACC opener. They lost those 2 games to fall to 5-3 overall. Since then, Duke is 19-3, and nobody's really talking about them. Their only losses at Carolina, really good team, at Wake Forest, whatever. Wake Forest is good, even though they're not playing like it of late. And of course, the Pitt game when Jeremy Roach, one of their most important players, was hurt. Well, Duke is healthy. All 4 of those guards, 3 of those guards are playing really well. Jared McCain's playing well. Tyrese Proctor's playing well. And Jeremy Roach, I think, is their most important player. Kyle Filipowski, the big guy. Yes, if you didn't know Kyle Filipowski's name 2 weeks ago, you do now. But he's a really good college basketball player. He's actually projected to be a pretty high profile NBA draft player. And listen, they shoot the ball well. They have good guard play. And what's interesting is I don't know that they have guys that can take over games totally the way that UConn does, or that a Jamal Shed at Houston does, or that Tennessee does, whatever. But again, they got 3, 4 guys that can get hot on any night. And I think, by the way, we'll learn a lot about them this weekend. ACC is a little bit down. Have they been beating up on bad teams, or have they turned a corner? There's some advanced metrics that tell you that they've actually been one of the better teams as they've gotten healthier. I have Duke at number 8. I do believe they can win it all, but I think things would have to break their way. Number 7, don't know if this is a controversial one or not, but I'm going to say it. I don't think it's likely, but I don't think it's impossible that the Kentucky Wildcats can win the national championship. Now, I know what everyone's going to say, Torres, they don't play any defense. And I get it. And again, I get that there are analytics that will tell you that if your defense is the way that Kentucky's is, that you are going to struggle to win 6 straight games. I get that. But what I keep coming back to is a few things. One, what did I say at the top? Do you have the dudes to compete at the highest level and win the games that matter in March? Kentucky does, and they've proved it over the last couple weeks. One at Mississippi State, one at Auburn, destroyed Alabama at home. And I go back to Wednesday night. I know it was Vanderbilt. I know Vanderbilt's not good, but they basically weren't playing well for 15 minutes of that game. And all of a sudden you look up, they got 45 points, and all of a sudden you look up, they got 93 points, and they ran away with that game. And when I look at that team, they have 7 or 8 guys that could get you 20 points on any given night. There is no team in the country like them. And what I don't think enough people are talking about is that it's not just Reed Sheppard and Rob Dillingham, the 2-star freshmen. It's not even Antonio Reeves, the 5th-year senior. You know, quietly, DJ Wagner, former number 1 recruit in America, is playing as well as he has since he got injured about probably 6-8 weeks ago. He's been playing really well the last couple weeks. Justin Edwards, I think over his last 8 or 9, is averaging like 14 points per game. Had that 30-point explosion against Alabama. And so I just bring it up because when I look at this Kentucky team, everybody's worried about the defense. I get it. But it's all about matchups, and this team can score on anybody. 91 points the other day against Mississippi State. That's a good defensive team. Arkansas, you can criticize, but when they want to play defense, they can. You put up 112 on them. Even the Tennessee game. Tennessee, they played Tennessee this weekend. They lost the first one, but they scored like 94 points. And so with this Kentucky team, do I think they will? I don't. But are they capable? Absolutely. And I will say, I think this conversation becomes much more interesting if they win at Tennessee on Saturday. They win against Tennessee on Saturday. I think that's going to open up a lot of people's eyes. I think they are capable of doing it. Let's go to number 6 on the list of the teams that I believe can win the national championship. Number 6, drum roll, please. It is the North Carolina Tar Heels. By the way, hate to brag, but if you remember, I think I was the only person in the national media in the preseason that had North Carolina in my preseason Final Four. By the way, for all the crap I get, preseason Final Four was Duke, Carolina, Tennessee, Creighton. Looking pretty good right now, neither here nor there. With Carolina, though, listen, they've been the same team that we've talked about all year. RJ Davis is a star. Armando Bacot is kind of the hard hat, do all the little stuff guy, rebound, energy, hustle, dive on the floor, whatever. And they just have really nice pieces around him. Cormac Ryan, the transfer from Notre Dame, is averaging double figures, shooting the ball well. Harrison Ingram is averaging double figures. And so this team has been awesome in ACC play. And obviously, again, I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of numbers, but defensively, they are a completely different team than they've been in years past. Now, my concern with Carolina is pretty straightforward. My concern with Carolina is that basically a couple things. One, are they too RJ Davis reliant? In other words, like RJ Davis is great, but do they have that second or third guy that can take over a game? I'm not sure that they do. Pretty much everybody else in the sport does. I'm not sure that Carolina does. The other thing, and this is kind of back to the ACC conversation, okay? The ACC is really down right now. NC State's not good. Notre Dame's not good. Louisville's terrible. We'll talk about their coaching search in a minute. Syracuse is not very good, although they're certainly better post Jim Boeheim, just like I told you they would be. And so I bring it up because are these teams really good, Or are they just beating up on bad teams in the ACC? I still think Carolina can do it. I do think they're very RJ Davis reliant. But the one thing I like, all those pieces fit. Everybody knows their roles. Everybody buys in. Another game that will be absolutely fascinating come this weekend as Duke plays Carolina. Let's keep it going. Number 5 on the teams that I believe can win the national championship. I'll be honest, they play tonight. We're recording here Thursday. It's 6:15 Eastern time. The Arizona Wildcats. So if Arizona goes to Pauley Pavilion and loses by 80 points, pretend this conversation never happened, but I still believe in Arizona because Arizona, they're kind of like Kentucky. They've had ebbs, they've had flows, they've had peaks, they've had valleys, but at the end of the day, they got dudes that can take over games. And so I don't need to see them win 15 straight because I know how good they can be when the bright lights come on. We talked about Arizona a few weeks ago. They have 6 or 7 guys that are going to play in the NBA. Now, all of them aren't going to be there next year, but Caleb Love is going to be playing in the NBA next year. Pelle Larsson going to be playing in the NBA next year. Some of their younger guys, KJ Lewis, Jaden Bradley, I believe it's going to take a little bit of time, but they will be playing in the NBA a few years from now. And so they have the talent. And the thing about Arizona, I do wonder, are they just a little bored in Pac-12 play? Because it's kind of the opposite of Duke and Carolina. Duke and Carolina lost a lot of big games in the non-con, but have been great in a watered-down ACC. Arizona's kind of the opposite. They won at Duke. They beat Michigan State on a neutral. They beat Wisconsin. They could have beat Purdue in Indianapolis. So they've proven they can play their best against the best teams. I just wonder if they're bored or are they, have they regressed over the course of the season? I think we'll find out a little bit about them over these next couple weeks. The LA schools in LA this weekend. Also worth noting, the Pac-12 tournament, they will probably, if they win this weekend, their 2 games, they'll be the 1 seed. They will have a decided home court advantage. By the way, I'll be in Vegas next week. Cannot wait to check out the Wildcats in person. My only real concern with them, and I think this is interesting, have they become too Caleb Love reliant? It's kind of interesting. Caleb Love, I think he tried to do too much at North Carolina to the detriment of that team. It seems as though at Arizona, they've kind of let Caleb Love cook, which is great. But there has been some regression from guys like Keyshawn Johnson. What's the other guy? Kylan Boswell, on and on. I do still think Arizona can turn it on, though. And the one thing I'll tell you is this. A lot of conversation. Are they going to get the 1 seed in the West? Is Tennessee? They get that 1 seed in the West. They are going to have a huge home court advantage if they get to the Sweet 16 at Staples Center, Crypto.com Arena. Also, they will have a huge home court advantage if they could get to the Final Four, which, of course, this year is in Phoenix. Arizona at number 5. Number 4, teams I think can win the national championship. Listen, we've talked about them a ton. I don't need to get too deep into them here. It is the Tennessee Volunteers. Listen, Tennessee, to me, everybody, every time you say anything, oh, what about Rick Barnes? Yeah, what about Rick Barnes? Listen, I mean, the guy has made a Final Four. He's made the Sweet 16 the last 2 years. And as we talked about on our Wednesday postgame show, remember, he made the Sweet 16 last year without Sakai Ziegler, who's probably his second most important player. And he made it without Dalton Knecht, who wasn't on the roster last year. So you take last year's team that made the Sweet 16, was a bucket away from the Elite 8, and you add Dalton Knecht and Sakai Ziegler, this thing starts to get really interesting for Tennessee. And so I've talked about them enough the last 10 days or so, but they defend. Dalton Knecht adds another level. And like Carolina, like a lot of these teams, it feels like everybody has bought into their role, bought into what they are supposed to do, and have bought into expectations in that program. I give Rick Barnes credit. Found Dalton Knecht in the portal. Now, I don't want to say found because a lot of people liked him. I don't think anybody thought he was going to be this. But Tennessee, to me, is good enough to win the national championship. Now, they got to win some games in March when it matters. I get all that. But are they good enough? Abso-freaking-lutely. Number 3. Speaking about they got a lot of stuff to prove. Purdue Boilermakers. So listen, everybody knows Torres has kind of had his differences with the Purdue fans and the Purdue fan base and whatever. Are they good enough to do it? Absolutely, though. Like the thing with Purdue, do I have my doubts? Yes. And my number one doubt is what I've told you since October. The thing with Purdue, why I worry about them, what did I tell you at the beginning? To win a national championship, you got to have dudes. You got to have NBA players. You got to have guys that can take over games. Zach Edey is the only guy on that roster that is going to play in the NBA. But they are better from last year. They added this kid, Lance Jones, out of the Missouri Valley, who's added another dimension to them. And really, two things stand out about Purdue, even though I have been critical of them. One, and this is important, they have the best resume of anybody in college basketball. Beat Tennessee on a neutral, beat Marquette on a neutral, beat Bama on a neutral, beat Arizona on a neutral that was in Indianapolis, so it was really basically a home court game for them, but nonetheless, they won. Just won at Illinois. So it's like, I can sit there and say, well, I mean, what happens when they face Tennessee or Arizona? It's like they've played them and they've beaten them. And so to me, they are good enough. Now the question becomes, will they do it? It's going to be very interesting to follow. And obviously, look, I think you can argue without a doubt there is no team that has more pressure on them in March than Purdue. Now, you could argue John Calipari has as much pressure as anybody. You could argue Rick Barnes has as much pressure as anybody. But as a team, every single guy on that roster, they are going to be feeling the heat the second they walk in the gym. Interesting pathway for them. They will almost certainly open in Indianapolis, so they will have a decided home court advantage. Listen, I'll say this. If you can't at least get to the Sweet 16 as the number 1 seed in Indianapolis, then there is no excuse and no one is going to feel any sympathy for you. I think Purdue is good enough. We'll see if they can do it. Listen, I do think it's a little bit of Final Four or bust for Purdue. They don't get to the Final Four this year. I don't think anybody's, going to question Matt Painter, but it's like, this is kind of the year you got to go ahead and do it. Purdue is the number 3 team on my list. Number 2 and number 1, listen, I'm not going to get crazy breaking down these two teams, but number 2 is the Houston Cougars. You know, Torres. Torres loves those Cougars. We love those Cougars here on the Aaron Torres pod, okay? But when I look at Houston, a couple things stand out to me. And when I look at Houston, what stands out is pretty straightforward, is that they are just, first of all, what they're doing, and we've talked about this a little bit, but remember, this is a team that was in the AAC last year. They have stepped into the Big 12, which everyone says is the toughest conference in college basketball, and I believe it. They're about to win the outright Big 12 title if they take care of business on Saturday against Kansas. And so when I look at this when I look at this Houston team, it is unbelievable what Kelvin Sampson is doing. And we just kind of accept, oh, they're Houston. They've been awesome. It's like, no, that's really hard to do what they've done. They're playing well. Everybody knows about the defense. Number 1 in the country in fewest points allowed. Number 3 in field goal percentage defense. Great rebounding team, tough, whatever. Here's the other crazy thing about Houston that nobody talks about. They are now down 3 key rotational players from the beginning of the year. Terrence Arsenault, middle of the season, tears his Achilles. Basically, maybe their best NBA prospect, honestly. The backup point guard, Ramon Walker, has not been playing of late. And then Joseph Tugler, the big man, one of their backup big guys, is out as well. So on the one hand, you worry if that depth eventually wears them down as you keep playing into March. But what they're doing is incredible. I think it's also worth noting with Houston, we worry about the offense, but Jamal Shedd's playing like a first-team All-American. And on top of that, and this is important, LJ Cryer, the transfer from Baylor, they basically brought him in to be their bucket getter. LJ Cryer has had 20-plus points in the last 3 games, 15-plus in the last 4. He is starting to play his best basketball. By the way, not sure how much you can hear in the background. We got a crazy thunderstorm going on here in Southern California. If I cut out, midstream here, we'll see what happens. We got some thunder and lightning going on in the background here. Anyway, number 1, teams that I think can win the national championship, goes without saying, and I'm not wearing the t-shirt just because, but it is the UConn Huskies. By the way, if you're a UConn fan, get your Maura Hurley tee, AaronTorresOnline.com/merchandise. Listen, I've said it. There's nothing else for me to add about this team. There's nothing else for anyone else to add. It's funny, and we've talked about this, but sometimes on Twitter, everybody wants to go above and beyond what the last person has. There's no new ground to cover with UConn. What they're doing is incredible. The opportunity to go back to back is incredible. I said it on Wednesday. I think the opportunity to go back to back without returning the majority of your team is absolutely incredible. Again, the last time a team went back to back, it was Florida about 20 years ago, and Florida returned their entire starting five. UConn lost its top three players from last year. They're all in the NBA, and they are just humming along, beating everybody, and better this year than they were at this time last year. I think the other key, which I mentioned on Wednesday, Alex Karaban, one of their returning starters from last year, had one of his best games in months on Wednesday night at Marquette. If he gets rolling on top of Cam Spencer, on top of Tristan Newton, this team is lethal. Now, we've talked about it. There's only two real weaknesses with this team. They don't have a ton of depth. They basically only play 7 guys. And I think it's interesting. Dan Hurley has played some of the freshmen more over the last couple games. I think one, it's probably to kind of keep them out of the portal after the season. But two, I think he knows I need another body or two that I can trust. But UConn is my number one team. So those are my 8 teams that I believe can win the national championship. Duke at 8, Kentucky 7, Carolina 6, Arizona 5, Tennessee 4, Purdue 3, Houston 2, UConn 1. As far as everybody else, listen, Kansas, I'm just over Kansas. They are who they are. They play 5 guys. They don't have any depth. They're not good enough. I'm out on them. Iowa State, I worry if they can score enough. They feel like a Sweet 16, Elite 8 capped type team. Marquette, I just don't know that they have enough size. Like, you just watch the UConn game, they just get beat up on the boards. There's a few others, but those are my 8 teams.